the Gold Coast of West Africa, along the shores of what is now Ghana, a slave ship approached the waters near Accra, brought in by the waves of the Gulf of Guinea. The ship, neither eye-catching in terms of wealth nor unremarkable, was but one of many among the endless parade of ships in a busy harbor that saw thousands upon thousands of strangers come and go every day. Yet the owner of the ship was quite the peculiar man, a man driven by nothing but the desire for profits. Sailing as part of a large slave trading syndicate native to the country of England, this man had taken his crew to West Africa to risk the future of his career and business ventures by undertaking one last risky trade. Indebted beyond all reasonable measure, the consequence of many years of unlucky trading, unfortunate business deals, and unexpected financial losses, the owner of the slave ship was desperate to turn his situation around. And it was here, in the city of Accra, that he was certain he would find the answers to his trouble. The owner, accompanied by the ship's surgeon, whose task was to identify healthy slaves fit for service, ventured into the city, where they made contact with a local slave trader. The three would then proceed to spend the following days screening and assessing potential slaves for purchase. The assessment process was a long physical examination of the slaves' overall health, an inspection that was to assure their ability to work for their future masters, an inspection that covered skin, teeth and gums, muscle tone, reflexes, on top of a small list of questions that aimed to evaluate the slave's mental state and awareness. The process seemed quite similar to that of a farmer buying an animal, for these poor souls were not seen or treated as people. To the slavers, they were simply cargo, bought at wholesale price with the intention to be sold for a profit. On the third day in Accra, the surgeon and the owner had together found 200 slaves that they were willing to purchase. Among the 200 slaves, one particular female stood out among the rest, specifically chosen by the surgeon himself. He had pointed out to the owner of the ship that this particular slave was pregnant, which most plantation owners would see as an attractive offer, as the long-term investment in a pregnant slave would potentially mean 2 slaves somewhere down the line. Yet despite the surgeon's early assessment of all of the slaves for purchase, and the ship now at capacity in terms of its carrying capability, the owner wasn't satisfied. 200 slaves sold for the current market price in America wouldn't make quite the dent in his massive amount of debt that he had hoped, and it would be months before he could return for another purchase. As setback, the owner wasn't willing to accept. The owner ordered the surgeon to continue his assessment of the slaves, and without any consideration for safety or reason, the owner demanded that the ship be not loaded, but packed to the brim with slaves from top to bottom, and so the surgeon continued his evaluations. In the following days, as the owner and the surgeon returned to the ship, the captain awaiting their return was met by a worrying sight at the harbor. From the city came the owner and the surgeon, yet what followed them was a massive horde of slaves, all meant for transport on this relatively small vessel. The captain did an immediate head count, and through his rough estimation, he recognized that the owner had brought far more than the ship could safely carry, both in terms of sanitation, but also in terms of food and water, over twice as many as what the captain himself would consider safe. Concerned for the safety of everyone aboard the ship, the captain approached the owner, stating his objections, refusing to undertake this journey unless the amount of slaves carried was reduced by at least 50%. But the owner didn't intend to listen. He was determined to bring the more than 400 slaves to America, and he wasn't about to let debts and misfortune drown his potential future success just because of some cowardly captain's pathetic premonitions. The captain could either sail the ship or find himself another job. An ultimatum which, to the owner's surprise and the rest of the crew's horror, made the captain leave immediately. Still, the owner remained determined to deliver his cargo and appointed the ship's surgeon as captain of the ship. Despite the first mate's and the rest of the crew's objections to the owner's intention of embarking on this dangerous expedition, all of their protests would fall on deaf ears. The many slaves were crammed into the cargo hold of the ship in horrendously claustrophobic and unsanitary conditions, and so the journey from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of America would commence. In the damp and insufferably hot cargo holds, among the crowds of bodies beneath the deck of the ship, the young female found herself pushed up against the wall, crammed in with the rest of the unfortunate souls, caressing her pregnant belly as the motion of the waves rocked them back and forth. A single tear ran down her cheek. She hadn't seen her husband in weeks and wasn't sure if she would ever see him again. Uncertain what awaited her and her unborn child at their destination, she tried her best to push the troubling thoughts out of her mind. Despite the horrendous and inhuman conditions of the many slaves beneath the deck, under the rays of the scorching equatorial sun, as the salty waves of the Atlantic Ocean lapped against the hull of the ship, the vessel had miraculously made its way from the Gold Coast of Africa to its supply point at Cape Verde and was now well on its way to America. With their newly acquired supplies of both food and water for the entirety of the ship's crew and its cargo, the owner felt confident that they'd make it to the east coast of America with the more than 400 slaves within the fortnight. After so many years of dismay and misfortune, a seemingly endless parade of unfortunate events, he looked forward to ridding himself of this crippling debt and finally get to live a life worthy of a man of his stature. Yet dark omens loomed on the horizon, for as the blanket of night fell over the ship, with only the stars to guide them towards their destination, in the hands of this newly appointed and inexperienced captain, the ship would vastly deviate from its course, sending it astray in the treacherous and dangerous waters. Night became day, and day became night, yet on the 10th day of hopeless navigation, somewhat sure of their heading, yet still clueless in terms of their bearing, the newly appointed captain, who was already strained far beyond his capabilities and clung to nothing but hope, was about to receive even more troubling news from the first mate. The young man had done an inventory count and to his horror realized that due to the massive increase in cargo, the ship and its crew had grossly miscalculated their demands for supplies at Cape Verde. The supplies that had been meant to last the ship for 6 weeks were now only days from running out, water more than anything. Yet when presented with the troubling issue of the depleting supplies, the owner of the ship didn't immediately seem worried. Certain that rain would come sooner rather than later, he assured the captain and the first mate that this lack of water would simply not become an issue and told them not to worry about it. Puzzled by the owner's lack of concern, the captain and the first mate took to rationing the food and water supplies themselves, yet ultimately, it would prove to make very little difference. The supplies were about to run out, no matter what. If the ship didn't find its way and reach a port soon, they would all be doomed to succumb to either starvation or dehydration. Days later, With the water supply running dangerously low and no sign of neither rain to come nor land in sight anywhere, the owner had contemplated the situation carefully and approached the first mate and the captain with a proposal, not just to save their lives, but also his purse. He explained that under the law and insurance contracts that govern slave trading, should the slaves die due to natural reasons such as starvation or dehydration, the insurance claim would be void and no compensation would be paid by the company. This would mean that the owner would lose a fortune. However, in the given circumstances, since slaves were by law considered cargo, should the slaves be dumped into the ocean to save the lives of the crew, then the insurance would cover their demise and pay a reimbursement for each slave that had been discarded. In the darkness of night, in the holes beneath the deck, the pregnant mother suddenly awoke to the loud screaming of angry voices. From the staircase above, silhouetted in the light of the moon, came the crew of the ship, barging into the cargo hold, barking orders at everyone around them. As the confusion settled, a row of about 15 slaves, all of them chained together at their ankles, were forced to stand up and follow the crew to the deck above before the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. A brief moment of silence followed their abrupt awakening before the tranquility of the night and subtle waves were replaced with loud objections. The objections turned to yelling, and as the yelling turned to screaming, what followed immediately after was the chilling splash of several heavy objects hitting the ocean at once. A chilling gasp of realization rippled through the cargo hold before a deadly silence swallowed it completely. Anxious eyes of ominous premonitions darted back and forth between the slaves, each individual in the hold realizing the gravity of the situation. The silence was deafening. The mother glanced down at the chains around her ankle and followed the rusty metal links to the slave next to her. To her surprise, he was looking at her as well. His eyes were wide open and spoke the same terror that had gripped her heart. She suddenly realized her lips had been moving, praying under her breath this entire time, praying for someone to help them. Yet before she managed to contemplate the situation further, the heavy wooden doors to the hold sprung open again. Muttered cries and shrieks of fear emerged from the darkest corners, as no one dared to draw any unnecessary attention to themselves. But as the crew of the ship barged down the stairs again, the muttered shrieks turned to loud cries of desperation. Panic erupted in the hold as the captain and his crew forced another row of slaves to their feet. Any objection or hesitation was immediately met with relentless beatings by either fists or wooden clubs. Bodies were bruised, jaws were broken, faces were gashed, and eyes were blackened. The mother's whispered prayers had now turned to cries of anguish, and as yet another row of slaves disappeared up the stairs and the heavy wooden doors to the hold slammed shut once again, the remaining crowd of terrified soon-to-be victims all knew that their final destination would not be America. A subtle metallic grinding suddenly caught her attention as she felt her ankle being jerked back and forth. It was the male slave next to her. He was attempting to file through the joint of the rusty bracelet on her ankle, the small part of the chain that held the two of them, and God only knows how many others down the line, together. In the darkness of the hold, she couldn't make out what he was using to file through the chain, but as their eyes met, he hesitated. She saw the glistening sweat of panic roll down his forehead, yet in the midst of her prayers and his hesitation, she felt his gaze search for her approval. Hesitant, she gave him a nod, and without any of them saying a word, the male slave continued to work on the chain. The screams of people being thrown overboard suddenly tore through the silence of the night once again, and it made him freeze. The impact of bodies crashing into the waves made him turn back to the chain with urgency, uttering involuntary whimpers of panic and distress as he, driven by fear, did his best to saw through the chain. Yet, it didn't take long for the slavers to return. She closed her eyes, focusing on her prayer. She begged to her gods to save her, yet even over the sound of her own voice and the whimpering yells and cries of people around her, she couldn't drown out the heavy group of boots that came closer and closer. And to her horror, as she opened her eyes, she saw the owner and the captain of the ship, the very man that had picked her out in the crowd in Accra, standing in front of her. Despite her objections and her cries for help, she was violently forced to her feet along with the others as the rest of the cargo hold squealed in fear. Commotion erupted behind them as the group was pushed up the stairs. Angry male voices turned to screams of struggle as shrieks of pain and terror, accompanied by a wave of barking orders, erupted in the holds below. The commotion came to a complete silence as the massive doors slammed shut behind them and the terrifying darkness of the cold night swallowed them, its silence only broken by the salty waves around them.
Go on, move!
The owner yelled as he pushed the group towards the ledge of the ship, yet the woman refused, fighting against the many hands that pushed her forward. However, as she turned around, before she could even verbally protest, she was grabbed by a group of strong hands that picked her from her feet and carried her towards the edge of darkness. She struggled to break free of their grip, and as the waves of the ocean came ever so close, she uttered a last desperate scream, wailing at the top of her lungs as she was tossed overboard with the rest of the group following right behind her. They nosedived towards the cold water, yet in her hopeless distress, she flailed her arms, and in her utter panic, by sheer luck, she caught a rope ladder hanging from the deck of the ship. The rest of the slaves screamed into the ocean beneath her, their combined weight pulling on the chain on her ankle. The weakened link snapped immediately, and she heard their helpless cries as they plunged into the dark ocean, their screams immediately turning silent. She found herself hanging from the ladder alone, clutching the rope and the wooden steps in a death grip. She felt her heart beating in her throat, gasping for air as her eyes darted to the roaring waves beneath her and to the stern of the ship, desperate to catch a glance of the others. They were long gone. Yet, as she listened carefully, in the gaps between her heaving and the constant waves rolling into the ship, she was almost certain that she heard someone, somewhere in the darkness, calling out for help. Gathering the last of her remaining strength, she clawed her way up the wooden ladder, words of involuntary prayer on her lips with every breath she took. Yet the closer she came to the top of the ladder, the more she realized that the screaming she had thought came from the ocean actually came from the deck above. As she crested the railing, she was met with the flickering flames from a broken oil lamp which had spilled onto the deck and set fire to the ship. Behind the flames, she saw a row of chained slaves fighting against the crewmates, with similar commotion and yelling coming from the hole beneath. Buckets, tools, and fists were thrown at the slavers as they attempted to avoid being tossed into the ocean. In front of her, in the middle of all of the chaos, she spotted the captain, or rather the surgeon, the very man who had evaluated them all, the very man that had brought them here in the first place. He was participating in the violence, shouting orders at crew members to beat up this person and that person. As she witnessed the captain beat one of the slaves into submission with a heavy telescope, a strange, foreign, boiling anger stirred inside of her. A relentless wrath she had never experienced before pushed her into a fit of rabid rage, and from the deck at her feet, she grabbed a sharp piece of buckled and crumbled iron and ran to the aid of the man cowering beneath the captain. Holding nothing back, She jammed the jagged piece of iron into the surgeon's neck. It pierced his skin and throat with a sickening thud, and he uttered a choking gasp, grabbing his throat as he crumpled to the wooden deck, dead in an instant. A brief feeling of relief and hope rushed over her, realizing that if they managed to take over the ship, they could go anywhere. They wouldn't have to be slaves anymore. She could go back home. She could see her husband once again. Yet suddenly, the glimpse of something sharp caught the corner of her eye, and her skull exploded in pain before her world turned black. As she came to, her head was pounding, ears were ringing. Confused, she realized she was leaning against the railing of the ship. Her eyes followed a thick stream of blood running from her face and down into the black nothingness. She realized she was staring at the ocean, the waves rushing past beneath her. As she turned her head, she saw the owner of the ship, his hands wrapped around her neck as he attempted to push her over the ledge. Panic set in as she with fist and nails clawed at the man, trying her best to get away, yet she couldn't break his grip. Like an animal in distress, she dug her fingers deep into his face, tearing up deep chunks of skin under her fingernails. The man roared in pain as she peeled skin from flesh, and in a rage-induced fit of anger, he pulled her away from the railing before he tossed her over the edge. For a second she was weightless, stuck in an empty silence of complete darkness. Then she plunged headfirst into the ocean, the cold dark water engulfing her in a tumbling roar of freezing waves that drowned out the screams and fighting above her. She struggled against the current, the brace on her ankle obstructing her ability to swim. In pure desperation, she broke the surface of the water, gasping for air as she frantically looked for the ship, knowing that her chances of catching onto it and getting back on board would be brief. Yet a terrifying horror jolted through her stomach as she suddenly realized it was already too late. Through the harsh waves tumbling her back and forth, she saw the stern of the ship already far out of her reach, leaving her behind. Beaten, battered and bruised, on the verge of absolute fatigue, she struggled to stay afloat. As the horror of reality set in, she finally understood there was no escape, no hope for rescue, and panic set in. She cried for her gods. She cried for her husband, fighting against the waves that constantly pulled her under. Hopelessness overpowered her with every stroke, knowing that certain death was waiting just below her. With the last remaining strength, she clawed herself to the surface, and there, in an instant, all of her sadness, anguish, and torment boiled up within her. A deep wrath and anger consumed her very soul, and with every inch of her being, she cursed the sailors and the slavers.
Got you! May the hungry one consume you in the dark. May the corruption eat away your humanity. Let the darkest of shadows feed on your misery. May it swallow your whole existence!
As the waves pulled her under the surface once again, she knew she wouldn't return. Her exhausted body, pushed far past the point of breaking, had no more struggle in it. As she screamed helplessly at the surface, water filled her lungs. Her mind still praying for hope, escape, anything to get her out of there. Yet the darkness beneath had anchored itself to her, and with its merciless pull, the depths of the ocean swallowed her whole. As the riot on the ship settled and the crew regained order among the slaves, the owner of the ship rejoiced at the solution. For while the conflict had been rough and violent, in the end, after all, his plan had worked. More than half of the cargo had been dumped. The crew and he were safe, and he would now be able to make his insurance claim upon their return to shore. However, unbeknownst to the owner of the ship, his journey was far from over. for a dark shadow now hung above him, following him and his crew. For somewhere in the layers between realms and realities, the curse of the drowning slave had manifested the darkest of entities. A presence conceptualized in misery, a creature molded in despair, an entity that fed on suffering. A gruesome demonic presence with one endless, never-ending desire to consume and corrupt. Yet, unfortunately, the slavers wouldn't suffer this fate on the open sea or alone. For with the shadow of darkness biting at their heels, the ship and its crew would by a complete coincidence condemn an entire state to fall victim to one of the worst paranormal occurrences ever documented, as the ship would reach a port in the state of Louisiana, the port of New Orleans. Hey there, Hazmat here. That concludes the original origin story of Showdown, and oh boy has this episode been a long time coming. The original idea of the narrative team was that this, much like all the other parts of the older lore of Showdown, would be found within the game in similar styles of fragmented storytelling and then be pieced together through ship manifests, logs, diaries, journals, and all that other stuff we usually find within the lore. Small disclaimer here in the end, this version is my interpretation of the original story, and therefore not 100% accurate, as I did have to fill out several missing gaps to make the narrative make sense. But it does have all of the major plot points originally conceptualized by the original narrative team. If you would like to hear more of this Banished lore, let me know in the comments below, as I potentially have a couple of more videos ready in the chamber. As always, a big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge, specifically the exclusive Gitchy Boy, the exclusive Johnny Sevens, the exclusive Warmonk, and the exclusive Rat. The VIPs, Corvo Bearslayer, Derivative, Doc Powell, Gino Lucero, Goose, Hambone, Jiminal Bob, Corey Peterson, Michael Thornhill, Morteth Menace, Hein, Slip, Stas Biestek, Sunrise Phoenix, TJ Crane, Texas Toast, and the Wizard of Copper, and of course, all the regulars. If you want to support me in the channel, consider signing up as a member, either here on YouTube or on Patreon, for as little as a single $1 a month. Link is in the description below. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.